May 31st, 1916. The North Sea, off the coast of Jutland, Denmark. 1,600 hours. A British battleship steams in column at the head of the 5th Battle Squadron, her four sister ships trailing behind, racing to close a gap that should never have opened. Ahead of her, the German High Seas Fleet's battlecruisers are tearing apart Beatty's battlecruiser squadron, HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary already gone. Thousands of men dead in minutes. Both ships are raced by single-magazine explosions so violent that survivors numbered in single digits out of crews of over 1,000. This ship and her sisters are the only things standing between Beatty's broken force and total disaster, and they are about to open fire at a range no other battleship afloat that day could match. Within the hour, this one ship will take 17 direct hits, suffer a jammed rudder that sends her into 2 complete circles directly in front of the entire German battle fleet, and still keep fighting. Critics in the years before the war had called her design rushed, her boilers unreliable, her hull already showing the strain of pushing speeds her designers never fully trusted. That afternoon at Jutland, this worn-out battleship's guns outranged every gun in either fleet. This is how a ship the Admiralty worried wouldn't hold together became the most dangerous weapon on the water. The strategic picture had been building for 2 years. Since August 1914, the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet had circled each other across the North Sea, neither side willing to risk the fleet action that could decide the war at sea in an afternoon, or lose it just as fast. Britain's blockade was slowly strangling the German economy, and Germany's surface fleet, badly outnumbered in capital ships, had spent the war's first 18 months looking for a way to even the odds rather than meet the Grand Fleet head-on. By the spring of 1916, Admiral Reinhard Scheer believed he had found it: lure a portion of the British fleet into a trap, destroyed in detail with the full weight of the German battle fleet lying in wait, and break the deadlock before American intervention or continued blockade made the question academic. Vice Admiral David Beatty's battlecruiser squadron sailed from Rosyth on May 30th to spring the trap in reverse, supported at a distance by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe's main battle fleet steaming down from Scapa Flow, the two forces converging on a stretch of sea neither side fully controlled. Attached to Beatty's force was the 5th Battle Squadron, for fast battleships built specifically to give his battlecruisers the heavy gun support they had always lacked, a deliberate answer to the uncomfortable fact that British battlecruisers traded armor for speed and could not absorb the punishment their German counterparts were built to withstand. A signal failure as the fleet sailed from Rosyth meant the squadron started the action some 10 miles behind where it should have been, a gap born of a single flag signal misread or never seen, a gap that would nearly cost Beatty everything when his battlecruisers ran headlong into Admiral Franz Hipper's battlecruiser force shortly after 1530 hours. In the opening 20 minutes of that engagement, with the 5th Battle Squadron still racing to close the distance, Beatty lost Indefatigable to a magazine explosion, then watched Queen Mary disintegrate in much the same way barely half an hour later. Beatty turned to his flag captain and remarked that there seemed to be something wrong with their bloody ships that day, a line that would be repeated in every account of the battle written afterward. The squadron racing up from behind was the only force on the British side capable of changing that equation before the rest of Beatty's command followed Indefatigable and Queen Mary to the bottom. To understand why what happened next mattered so much, you have to understand what kind of ship was racing to close that gap, because on paper, the design had worried people from the start. Laid down in 1912 as part of the first class of battleships designed to burn oil instead of coal, she and her sisters were a calculated gamble pushed through against real institutional resistance. A hull built for 25 knots, when most battleships of the era struggled past 21, propelled by boilers and turbines pushed to a specification the Admiralty's own engineers privately doubted could be. Sustained in service over years of wartime steaming. The decision to abandon coal entirely, rather than mix the two fuels as earlier classes had done, meant the entire squadron depended on oil supply lines that did not yet fully exist when the ships were ordered, a strategic vulnerability critics raised loudly in the years before the war. Early sea trials had exposed turbine vibration problems and boiler tube failures serious enough that some naval commentators questioned whether the entire class had been rushed into existence to win an argument about oil, fuel, and high speed, rather than to win a war. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had personally championed the class against significant opposition within the naval establishment, and critics who distrusted Churchill's judgment on technical matters were quick to point to every boiler tube failure as vindication. By 1916, after 18 months of hard wartime steaming with minimal refit time, parts of the engineering establishment considered her machinery worn down well below the standard expected of a ship barely 3 years old, her boiler tubes patched rather than replaced, her turbines run for months past intervals that peacetime maintenance schedules would never have permitted. What the critics had not weighed properly was the one decision that mattered more than any boiler tube. She carried 8 15-inch guns, the first battleships in any navy to mount that caliber operationally, firing a 1,920-pound shell that outranged every German battlecruiser and battleship gun on the field that day by several thousand yards, and outranged even the 13.5-inch guns carried by Britain's own older battlecruisers. The choice of caliber had itself been controversial. The gun had been designed and ordered into production before a single prototype had completed full trials, another gamble layered on top of the oil fuel gamble, on the theory that waiting for exhaustive testing would hand Germany time to match or exceed it first. Her fire control tables and rangefinders had been built specifically around exploiting that reach, designed to let her open accurate fire and inflict damage at distances where no German gun could effectively reply, a doctrine of standoff firepower that only worked if the ship herself could survive long enough to use it. The same admiralty that worried about her engines had given her, almost as an afterthought to the oil fuel gamble, the single most powerful naval rifle afloat anywhere in the world in 1916. If you're enjoying this look at how the Royal Navy turned a calculated risk into a decisive advantage, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep producing deep dives like this one. At 1,648 hours, with Beatty's battlecruisers already burning and 2 of his ships already gone, the 5th Battle Squadron finally closed the range and opened fire on the German battlecruisers from roughly 19,000 yards, a distance at which German guns could barely reply with any accuracy, and this ship's gunners could place 15-inch shells with real confidence. Her salvos began straddling the German battlecruiser Von der Tann within minutes, the towering splashes from near misses confirming to her spotters that the range had been found, and across the squadron's combined fire the German line began taking damage it had not expected to absorb so early in the action. Damage that forced Hipper's ships to alter course repeatedly to throw off the British. Gunnery solutions. For the first time since the engagement opened, the German battlecruisers were the ones absorbing punishment rather than handing it out. Then, at 1,654 hours, disaster nearly struck from within rather than from the enemy. A jammed steering mechanism, the product of either battle damage to her hydraulics or simple mechanical failure under the strain of high-speed maneuvering, sent her into an uncontrolled turn, swinging her through 2 complete 360-degree circles directly under the guns of the entire German high seas fleet as Scheer's main battleship divisions came into view from the south for the first time that day. For roughly 8 minutes, she sat almost stationary relative to the German line, the single most exposed ship in either fleet, no longer able to control her own course, drawing concentrated fire from German battleships that should, by every reasonable expectation, have ended her there in the water. Accounts from her own crew afterward described the bridge crew working frantically at emergency steering controls while shells straddled the ship from multiple directions, the sea around her thrown up in towering columns of water, and smoke that briefly obscured her from some of the German gunners aiming at her. She took 17 direct hits during that ordeal and the gunnery exchange that followed, shells striking her armor belt, her secondary battery, her upper works and superstructure, flooding compartments below the waterline and starting fires across the ship that her damage control parties fought even as the steering crisis continued. One hit penetrated near a secondary turret and killed or wounded most of the gun crew inside. Another started a fire dangerously close to ammunition stores that was brought under control only through immediate flooding of the adjacent magazine, the exact emergency procedure that Indefatigable and Queen Mary's crews had not managed to execute in time earlier that same afternoon. Her own return fire never stopped throughout the ordeal. Even circling out of control, her gunners kept finding the range on German ships, and the accidental maneuver, disastrous as it looked from the bridge, briefly drew German fire away from Beatty's already battered battlecruisers, fire that might otherwise have sunk one or more of them outright in the minutes that followed. By the time her steering was restored and she limped clear of the worst of the close engagement, she had absorbed punishment that would have broken many ships of her generation and inflicted damage on the German line that contributed directly to crippling the battlecruiser Seydlitz, already torpedoed earlier in the day, and damaging others in Hipper's squadron badly enough to limit their effectiveness for the remainder of the battle. The ship's part in the wider battle was not incidental, and it did not end with her own near destruction. Her squadron's long-range fire, open from a distance the German fleet could not answer, forced Scheer's battlecruisers to absorb damage they had not planned for the very start of the main engagement, damage that compounded through the rest of the day as the full battle fleets came into contact during the famous moment when Jellicoe's Grand Fleet, deploying from cruising formation into a single line of battle, crossed the German fleet's path not once, but twice, a maneuver naval historians still study as one of the most decisive tactical movements of the Dreadnought era. The 5th Battle Squadron, despite the damage inflicted on its lead ship, remained a coherent fighting force throughout the engagement, screening the rear of the British line during the confused night actions that followed as both fleets maneuvered in darkness, neither side certain exactly where the other lay. Her survival through 17 hits and an uncontrolled double circle under concentrated German fire became one of the defining images of British endurance at Jutland, proof that the ship's structural integrity, whatever the pre-war critics had said about rushed boilers and unproven turbines, held under conditions her designers had never specifically tested for and likely never imagined when the hull was laid down in 1912. She was steamed back to Rosyth under her own power for repairs that kept her out of action for several weeks, the most heavily damaged British capital ship to survive the battle, her crew working alongside dockyard engineers through the repair period in scenes that became something of a minor sensation in the British press once details of the battle's ferocity began to circulate. The strategic consequence outlived the single afternoon by years. Jutland itself ended inconclusively in the narrow tactical sense, with both fleets claiming victory in their respective press, the Germans pointing to greater British tonnage sunk, the British pointing to the high seas fleet's retreat under cover of darkness and its refusal to risk a daylight continuation of the engagement. But the Royal Navy's command of the North Sea and the blockade strangling Germany's economy and ultimately its capacity to continue the war, remained unbroken throughout. The high seas fleet sortied only once more in real strength before the war's end, in August 1916, and turned back without engaging when British submarines and the threat of the Grand Fleet's superior numbers made the risk unacceptable to sheer. Germany's surface fleet spent the remainder of the war largely in harbor, its crews increasingly demoralized by inactivity, a discontent that would eventually feed into the naval mutinies of late 1918 that helped bring down the German imperial government itself. The class of fast battleship that had been gambled into existence on unproven boilers and an unfamiliar fuel went on to form the backbone of British battleship strength through two world wars. Several of her sisters, serving on through 1945 in roles their original designers could scarcely have anticipated, modernized repeatedly, their hulls and machinery rebuilt, and their armament updated even as. The basic 15-inch gun armament that had defined the class in 1912 remained in service and remained respected by every navy that encountered it. One sister ship would go on to serve at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, and another would survive sustained air attack during the Norwegian campaign and the Mediterranean convoys, evidence that the oil-fueled gamble Churchill had championed against institutional skepticism had paid off across a span of decades its critics had never imagined the class would reach. Within the squadron itself, the other three battleships had absorbed their own share of punishment that afternoon, though none so severe as the lead ship's ordeal during the steering failure. One took a hit below her waterline that flooded a boiler room and forced her to drop speed for the remainder of the engagement, her crew shoring up bulkheads by hand through the night to keep the flooding contained until repairs could be made in harbor. Another took damage to a turret roof that put one of her main guns out of action for the rest of the battle, though her gunnery officer kept the remaining three turrets firing in coordinated salvos that German observers later noted as unusually accurate for a squadron under that degree of pressure. The squadron's combined log of hits taken and hits scored, reconstructed by naval historians from German and British records after the war, suggested that the 5th Battle Squadron alone had inflicted a disproportionate share of the damage suffered by Hipper's battlecruisers relative to the brief window in which its guns had actually been in range, a statistic that post-war inquiries into the battle's gunnery returns cited repeatedly when assessing which British units had performed above expectation. What the battle proved was not that the pre-war critics had been wrong about the engineering risks. They had not been wrong. The turbines had been pushed to an unproven specification before adequate trials confirmed their reliability. The oil-fired boilers had been a genuine technical gamble dependent on supply infrastructure that took years to mature, and the strain of wartime steaming really had left her below the condition a newer ship of comparable age should reasonably have shown by 1916. What the battle proved was that the single decision to outgun rather than simply out-armor the opposition could outweigh every mechanical shortcoming the critics had correctly identified on paper years before a shot was fired in anger. A ship with war machinery and a jammed rudder, exposed for 8 minutes under the guns of an entire enemy battle fleet, survived and kept fighting because the range of her guns let her hurt the enemy before the enemy could effectively hurt her in return, and because the crews who operated those guns and fought those fires had been trained to a standard that compensated for every mechanical weakness the engineers had warned about. The critics had measured her boilers and her turbines, and their measurements had been accurate. They had not measured what 8 15-inch guns, reaching further than anything else on the water that day, would mean when the moment actually came, or what a crew determined not to follow Indefatigable and Queen Mary to the bottom of the North Sea could accomplish even in a ship the engineers themselves were not entirely sure would hold together under fire.